Hey, thanks for checking out my video. Today we're going to paint a baby deer or a fawn based upon this reference photo that I took earlier this year in the summer months,
Hey Google,
looking down off of our back deck down a hill at a fawn that was kind of resting and snacking amongst a mulch bed and some fern. So we'll take some poetic license here as we work through this painting. We're going to be working in pastel. And right now, what I'm doing is just laying out the basic elements of the drawing using a pastel pencil with a very light touch. And I'm painting on UArt sanded paper, 9 inches by 12 inches. And I believe it's a 400 grit paper. I have the paper taped to my drawing board, which I have fastened to a wall in my studio. I set this setup up about, nearly 20 years ago and didn't use it very much. My intention all along was to be able to have easy access to draw and paint with pastels, which is a way that I kept in touch with my creative drives during years when there was a little more hustle and bustle. And, we were working 12 to 16 hours a day and commuting an hour to 2 hours each way, kind of crazy time. So wasn't able to paint or draw very much during that period, but fast forward to now and I am, and I'm grateful that we have this space set up. So as I work through this drawing, I'm setting up a slightly higher horizon line, and my intention here is to emphasize the point of view from which we're looking down upon this younger fawn. I want to accentuate the fact that we're looking down upon it, so the perspective used to draw the fern hopefully makes a little bit more sense, as you'll see the body proportions will be set up in a way such that it's intended to provide clues that we are looking down upon the fawn in the lower lying land that it's sitting within amongst the fern that we draw in. So again, using a very light touch, starting to put in the legs here. The intention here is just to do a very basic light line drawing, devoid of any detail at all. We're not looking to create a fantastic drawing. We're just looking to get the proportions roughly right, the position of the key elements of the scene, and every now and again I'll emphasize certain features like the eyes, like I just did, and the ears, because those are going to be critically important aspects of this drawing to help emphasize the youthly aspects of this fawn, which is the star of the show, which is always important to keep in mind. So I will put an image of the original photo up on the upper right hand corner of the screen from time to time as we begin to accelerate through this. And what you'll notice in the area that I'm sketching right now with those vertical lines, those are intended to be trees. The actual photo itself, as you can see up on screen right now, is cut off just above the ears of the fawn. And I'm going to use a little bit of my imagination and creativity, stored memory, to essentially create the feel that there's a forest behind the fawn. So you're going to see some trees and brush and sky holes through a thicker forest. And my plan is to render that completely from imagination, which should be a unique challenge. But plenty of stored memory, based upon a lifetime of spending time in the woods and just gazing off into the woods off of our back deck as well. So I'm getting close to wrapping up the actual drawing here, thinking that I'm going to transition over to the actual soft pastel sticks that I'll be working with. And I'll use a wide array of different brands. Too many for me to list here, but I'll use UArt. I'll use some of the student quality soft pastels occasionally, especially in the beginning, like the stick that I have here, some charcoal as well, to really accentuate some of the darker values within the scene. That's really the purpose of using the charcoal sticks that I'm using, for example, right now. All along the way in the beginning, I'll be using a very light touch because we don't want to fully saturate the teeth of the sanded paper. And from time to time, I will actually rub down the pigment that's on the sanded paper with the intention of giving myself a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to adding additional layers down the road. And to take that a step further, I will also occasionally use a dry brush to knock some of the pigment off the paper while blending. And that will give me a little bit more of a longer runway to add additional layers as we get further along in the painting. Now, in these beginning phases, before any details are even visible, as I'm adding these different notes, I'm starting with a focus on the darkest areas of the painting, almost like you would if you've attempted to paint in oil paints. We tend to find that it's easier to start with your darkest values. It kind of serves a couple different purposes. It provides a little bit of a roadmap for the entire painting. It also makes it easier to blend and draw out those highlight areas when you start with the darkest values, which are typically going to be found within the shadows or the shadow pattern within the scene. And as you do that, you'll find that the actual scene will emerge. It's barely visible with that light sketch that I made, and now that we're getting some of these bigger shapes in, indicative of the darker areas within the painting, you'll start to see the emergence of the scene, slowly but surely. Now, occasionally you'll see me step away from the surface and try to step back and see a broader view of the image, or a bird's eye view, if you will. This kind of helps you stay on track with proportions and the design of the painting. In addition to that, you'll hear me take some deep breaths sometimes too. And that is a technique that's used to help relax. It's a relaxation technique. And by doing it, you actually have a better chance of tapping into stored memory, emotions, and your subconscious or imagination, however it is you want to put it. And the reason why that's important is because that will help you tap into the feelings and sensations that you may have experienced when you first were inspired to paint a scene from the very beginning. Now I'm laying in some notes using a color that's similar to sap green, and I'll keep going back and forth between some of the darker colors. Now I have something close to burnt umber, which I'm laying in, just big shapes still with a very light touch. And it kind of looks like a big scrambled mess right now, with the exception of a couple of sharper lines that I'm putting in more as notes, just to help me cue in on specific shapes and design features for later reference. But for the most part, just using the side of the pastel stick with a very light touch, putting in broad, light marks, mostly with darker pigments. So as part of my painting practice, I tend to work most frequently with pastels and oil paints, but occasionally with casein and watercolor and other medium as well. In addition to that, my subject matters tend to focus in most frequently on landscape paintings, but I also like to switch it up to occasionally doing architectural drawings and paintings, portraits of human beings, but I really love these animal paintings. You kind of get the best of both worlds with an animal portrait or an animal painting, whether it's a dog portrait that you've been hired to paint for a friend or a client, or if it's something like this, painted on plein air or from reference photos like this little guy. And one of the reasons why I enjoy animals is because, just like humans, they have their own unique spirit, their own unique personality, and you can try and capture that in addition to the surrounding scene and just the general vibe that you've experienced at that moment. And in addition to that, there's less worry about hurting the animal's feelings. Of course, when you're hired to do a pet portrait, sometimes those will come into play and it gets a little tricky. But in instances like this, where I'm never likely to meet up with this animal's owner to potentially judge my work, it's a much more relaxed and easy process. It's a lot of fun. And as an artist, you still have a nice, challenging way to hone your skills and improve your craft while doing it. I put a little thumbnail image of some additional animal paintings that I've done before, including birds and other wild animals and livestock. But I typically will do this on occasion and not quite as frequently as my landscape paintings. And if you want to check out more animal, livestock, and pet portrait paintings, check out my website. Here you can see I'm using a dry, relatively clean bristle brush to flatten out the colors, also blend them so they cover more of the surface. What I find too is some of the excess pigment will get knocked off. You want to be careful to not stir up too much dust, and if you are a little bit rougher or working in less well ventilated conditions or windy conditions, you may want to wear a face covering so as to ensure you don't breathe in any of that dust. It's not really that good for you, and oftentimes there are some chemicals that you definitely would not want to ingest or inhale. But one of the advantages of doing that is it creates more room for you to add additional layers to the sanded paper, because you expose more of the tooth and you leave some of the existing color that you've laid in. So as you progress into the painting, it helps you create more illusions of detail, more color effects with the layering of the opaque pastel colors, because you have a little bit of a longer runway to work with. Without doing that, without doing that brush work, you might find that you've saturated the paper and you reduce your ability to get those additional colors on later on in the painting process. So you may have noticed I've been using a couple of variations of brown, kind of a burnt umber, and maybe a raw sienna type color, just to reinforce some of the shapes, the bigger shapes within the fawn and the shapes that are of a similar value and color, like the fallen tree behind the fawn and some of the foliage throughout the forest floor. So I'm adding those lines and those shapes still with a very light touch, just trying to refine them. I'll add a little to the live trees that are in the background. They're a little bit closer to the foreground because you do see that shade within the dark as well. And as is always the case, and as I mentioned a couple of times, when you're working with pastel, you are using an opaque, solid color layered over another series of opaque colors. And that's ultimately how you get a little bit more of a finer tuning to the colors, essentially how you're color mixing when you're using pastel. Now I'm working my way through adding a little blue to some of the darker shadow areas. I want to make sure there's a little bit of a balance of cool and warm tones within those darker shadow areas. Right now, adding those cooler tones, using what is, I would say, is pretty close to a cobalt blue, somewhere in between ultramarine and cobalt blue type shade that I have available amongst my soft pastel sticks. And just go ahead and push that throughout in this case, because we want to use the advantage of atmospheric perspective to have those areas, those shapes in the background drop back and hopefully create a sense of three-dimensionality within this scene. So now I'm coming through with some lighter valued browns and pinks even, and some lighter grays, mainly because I want to just give myself a little bit of guidance within this painting for where some of those lighter areas are. These are by no means the brightest highlights. These are some of the brightest mid-tone shades that make up the fawn. And I'm laying those in because I want to give myself time to work through the actual shapes themselves, make refinements as I make my way throughout the entire scene, going back and forth from the foreground to the mid and to the background. So I'm putting some of these shapes in, and they do look quite bright, but they're nowhere near the brightest colors that we'll see in this scene or even on the fawn himself. These are just the areas that I want to emphasize, including little patches of fur that are on the chest area, the lighter areas around the brow ridge and in the ear, which I will overlay with much pinker and purple type hues in a bit. The brightest areas on this deer ultimately will be the little pieces of fringe hair on the belly area, the light, almost white color space around the nose and its muzzle, and then also the white spots that are typically found on young deer like this one. And we'll put those in much later on in the process. Much like is the case with the oil painting process, it's easier to reserve the highlights for the very end of the painting. Generally speaking, it's a good rule of thumb to follow, and the same is the case for working with soft pastel. At this point, I'm paying particularly close attention to the contours of the major shapes, both those shapes that make up the fawn or the deer itself, but also other major players within this scene, including that fallen tree that I'm working on right now. And I'll basically move to the outside contours of all the major shapes, inward to some of the shapes within the shapes like I'm doing right now, and then move back out. The same way I'll go back and forth between working on the lighter value information within each shape and the darker value. And I'll just keep working my way through this scene in that fashion until I get it to where I want it to be. Right now I'm just putting some random strokes of kind of a light orange. Now I'm going in and switching gears a little bit. And I have what was almost like that dioxazine purple that I had been using earlier. And I'll just put random marks all around the scene. No real goal in mind, just kind of feeling my way around, working toward the next major decision, and also building some unity within the image, ensuring that similar colors and hues are found. Now we're going to zoom in and just take a little bit of a closer look, closer to the surface here, in an effort to make it easier for you to see the specific details from which I'm focusing on within the image, and also the colors that I'm using and the application by way of the strokes that I use to apply the soft pastel. So in just a few moments, we'll zoom in so you can see a little bit better here. There you go. Now from this point forward, you should have a much easier time having a better sense for how I'm actually applying the soft pastel. And here I have a brownish color. How's that for color science? And I'm intentionally still using lighter strokes, shorter strokes, with the intention of building up textures, hoping that in the end it'll help ensure that this particular area I'm working within resembles the fur that you'd actually see on the deer that we're rendering right now. And while I'm doing this, I'm taking some care, given that the value of this particular shade of brown is a little bit lighter than the burnt umber type brown that I had applied earlier in this session. I'm trying to focus on putting this down in areas within the image that are indicative of raised spots that are a little bit more elevated on the deer based upon their bone structure. Their leg muscles, like I just kind of indicated there on their rear thigh, bony areas that might be sticking out, and picking up on the actual plane that we're rendering a little bit more light, and therefore they look a little lighter. So that's where I'm applying this, toward the top of the deer as well, where the light will be casting down a little bit from the sky. And that's essentially what I have in mind as I work my way through. The only time where that might be a little bit of a different mindset, and as far as how I apply this lighter shade of brown, is when I am getting close to the undercarriage, where there are some lighter hairs near the belly of this young deer. I'm going to go ahead and put that thumbnail image back in the upper right hand corner for you, so you could take another look and compare and contrast the work that I'm doing in pastel within the painting that I'm creating here. I am taking some pretty significant license, if you will, creative license, poetic license, whatever you want to call it, because my goal is to create a pastel painting that reconnects me to the feelings that I had that ultimately inspired me to rush to snap a picture of this young fawn in our backyard back earlier this year in the warmer months. So after working on the fawn itself for a while, you can see I'm moving toward wrapping up a lot of the structural work as it relates to the deer itself, kind of making sure that the final proportions are adjusted, indications of the main parts of the bone structure, the position of the neck, the position of the ears, and all that good stuff are laid out. And I'm going to move into the background. As mentioned, throughout this whole process, I'm going to move from the back to the midground, to the foreground, to the deer, and then back to the background over and over again. Right now, I'm just laying in some cooler blue that will kind of overlay much of the sky holes. And it is quite a bit too intense and saturated, so we're going to look to use that to our advantage. And we'll gray it out slowly. We'll take a couple passes at this with the intention of building up the opportunities to suggest enhanced depth where we might have a hard time seeing through the infinite in real life, the infinite rows and rows of trees and branches and leaves and dried foliage and other things that we might see as we gaze through a thick forest like this. So we're going to look to create that kind of illusion. We're going to use a little bit of brushwork here with a dry brush to flatten that out a little bit and blur it, hopefully push it back even further. And then we'll get working again with our pastels. All right, got the darks in. Go ahead and start putting the midtones and highlights in. What's up, Holly? What's up? So at this point, I have just about all of the major detail set in. As I finish adding some of these youthful spots that young fawn will have on their coats. And from this point forward, it'll be important for me to take a step back and think through every additional mark that I make, so as to not set myself back and put myself in a position where I'm working out of a corner that I back myself into. So I'll be moving slow, taking time to step back, comparing it to the photo and analyzing how I can go about bringing more life into this painting. So I'm making my way through, and these are some of the brightest highlights. I will add some pure white in some select areas as I make my way through that need to see a brighter value and perhaps maybe a certain type of texture. But for the most part, the brightest brights are incorporated into the painting at this point. And I think most of the work will probably be in the background and in the effort to bring some additional textures into the deers. So now it's time for a little bit of a bravery test. Where to put these fern? And I'm going to put a little green here and there and everywhere just to bring some continuity to the painting. But now I'm also going to bring to life some of the fern in the foreground. And I, by and large, like the way that the photo appears with regards to where the fern are located and their shapes that they bring to the painting. And I'll emulate it in some spots, and I will deviate from what I see in other spots in an attempt to enhance the painting. And there's always a little bit of a gamble associated with taking those sorts of leaps of faith and using your imagination. Mind you, I have not really sketched this out in advance, so it very much will be, any adaptation that I make will be a bit of a gamble. And I'll just hope that it'll work out in my favor here with this particular painting, because I've already put a lot of time and effort into it. So you can see I drew some of the lines that will likely be the stems associated with some of the fern in the foreground and some of the greenery in the background. And I'll go ahead and I'll use some abrupt strokes side to side using the edge of the pastel stick to try and model the very thin, elegant leaves that are part of the fern that we see here in northeastern Pennsylvania throughout the spring, summer, and early. So far, so good. I'm liking the general shapes of these fern. I think it's drawing the eye into the painting and directing it at the main star of the show, which is the fawn. It's also helping to build an additional series of layers, creating depth. And I think I'll be able to enhance these shapes with some indications of some highlights. I have a few more to go. I'm going to enhance some of the sky holes in the background, and I'll try and key off of the light effect that's created here with the remainder of the painting and many of the highlights that are incorporated in the background, midground, and foreground. Still using a very light touch. I don't want to create real strong lines here. Kind of want broken color and want it to blend in with the existing colors that are there. Just want to create a little subtle set of hints indicating far more depth than there might have been existing already in the painting just by adding these little sky holes that kind of cut out the little space in between the trees and remaining foliage and branches, indicating our ability to see through the forest, through that nearly infinite depth. And I think all right, we'll sprinkle in some more highlights here on the fern and elsewhere. And as I mentioned earlier, taking a little extra time, I'm going to pull in some variations into the fur on our fawn here. I'm going to focus in on the ear, in this case on this particular ear on the left, or on the fawn's right side, kind of using strokes that will hopefully enhance the rounded concave feeling of that particular ear that's pointed at us, and conversely on the other side, on the right hand side, do the same thing, and also within the fur as well, trying to kind of honor nature as best as I can. Obviously, I've seen a lot of deer where I live, and this is a pretty good photo. So I know, for example, on the legs, the fur will tend to run down in the same direction that the leg actually protrudes out of the torso. And we'll try in every instance, try to honor that. As we go down the snout, it'll run down the snout in alignment with the direction of that snout and the jowl as well. And where I do little touches on the forehead and on the back as well, the fur will tend to run in a specific direction, and I'll try and honor that in hopes that the textures that we create make it look just a little bit more real with minimal effort. And we'll use some of that same color to run back into the fern off in the distance. It is a little bit of a cooler color. Many of those fern will be off in the shade, and they might appear to be a little cooler in the distance. And we'll just keep working our way around, trying to create balance and harmony throughout the painting here. And more So I'm incorporating this blue, which is kind of like an ultramarine blue, maybe a little bit of cobalt, leaning toward the cobalt blue side of the equation, and using that in hopes to kind of push a little bit harder, push the concept of atmospheric perspective in hopes that that cooler blue, the darker blue, will push the background further back and increase the depth. Very hard to see while you're looking at my beautiful plaid shirt, but you kind of see it now. And I'll work that in from time to time. Hopefully I won't overuse it. But the hope is to enhance the painting itself. Now I'm incorporating a pastel pencil. This is pure white. I'm using still a very light touch, just looking to create some highlights. On occasion, I'll have to push a little bit harder in order to make a mark because there are quite a few layers of pastel. But my hope is to focus in on texture here and create some illusions of highlight areas throughout the shape that So I'm wrapping up the last few marks here, just looking to create some balance and variety amongst the marks. And I'll probably detach myself from this for a few hours and take another look at it to make sure there's no opportunities to fix subtle areas that need to be corrected a little bit. But for the most part, it's done. I do see I could enhance the eyes a little bit. I'm going to put some marks there intended to suggest either lashes or sparkly highlights within the eyes, because you do see that with these deer depending upon the lighting that they're in. And I might make some quick touches here or there, but for the most part, we'll consider this a wrap. I appreciate you checking out my video. Check out my website at thomasmichaelnieman.com for more sneak peeks of different works and stuff that I have available. My shop is up and running, so there are pieces like this that are available for purchase. And I appreciate your support. Thanks so much. Stay well. Hope to see you again next